The group of friends hiked along the narrow trail, backpacks weighing on their shoulders, their voices a mix of excitement and nervous laughter. Led by Jake, the boldest of the group, they had finally entered the infamous Blackwood Forest. There was something magnetic yet foreboding about the place, as though the trees and shadows held secrets that shouldn't be uncovered. With every step, the forest seemed denser, the twisted branches overhead casting long, skeletal shadows on the ground. When they reached the clearing they'd chosen for their campsite, Jake helped everyone set up their tents, his adventurous spirit infectious. Beside him, Matt, the group's skeptic, scoffed at the local legends and cracked jokes, dismissing anything remotely supernatural. He didn't believe in monsters or ghost stories, especially not the tales that small-town locals spread. Meanwhile, Sarah, a horror enthusiast, felt a thrill of both excitement and dread creeping up her spine. She was the one who had always pushed for these kinds of adventures, even if a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind warned her to be careful. As they finished setting up the last tent, Eric, the quiet, more easily frightened member of the group, froze suddenly, glancing around with a furrowed brow. He'd noticed something strange, deep scratch marks carved into a few nearby trees, like claw marks from some massive animal. "Hey, do you guys see this?" he asked, pointing out the scratches. Jake just chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Probably just some animal, maybe a bear." "Relax, Eric, you'll get used to it." But Eric couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching them. As dusk settled over the forest and the group made themselves comfortable, the woods fell into an unnerving silence, as if the forest itself were waiting, watching them, holding its breath for the right moment to reveal its darkest secrets. Night had fallen completely, casting an inky darkness over Blackwood Forest. The only light came from the small fire Jake had built, its flickering flames casting odd shadows that danced across the trees. The group sat in a loose circle around the fire, sharing snacks and laughing off any lingering fears. Yet, despite the warmth of the fire and the laughter, an uneasy tension lingered, hovering just beyond the circle of light. Eric was the first to hear it, a distant, low thud, like a heavy footstep deep in the woods. He looked up, eyes wide, but said nothing. Then another sound came, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. This time, everyone heard it. They fell silent, straining to listen. The noises seemed to circle around them, slow and deliberate, as if something were moving just beyond the firelight, watching and waiting. "What do you think it is?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Probably just a deer or something," Matt said, trying to sound casual, though he was clearly on edge. "Animals make noise, especially at night." But Eric shook his head. "That didn't sound like any animal," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "It sounded bigger." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Jake quickly laughed, dismissing the sounds as nothing more than their imaginations running wild. "We're in a forest. Of course, there are animals out there," he said confidently, tossing another log onto the fire. Reluctantly, they tried to brush off the strange noises and went back to their conversation, though each of them kept casting wary glances over their shoulders. The sounds eventually faded, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet none of them could fully shake the feeling that something had been watching them, hidden just beyond the light, biding its time. The next morning, the group woke to a cold, misty dawn. After a quiet breakfast, Jake suggested they take a short hike deeper into the woods to explore. Sarah and Matt agreed, eager to shake off the eerie events of the previous night. Eric, however, looked uneasy. The strange noises and feeling of being watched had lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over the otherwise beautiful morning. As they walked, the forest around them seemed strangely still, with barely a bird call or rustling leaf to break the silence. They soon stumbled upon something unsettling, deep scratch marks etched into several tree trunks, like claw marks from a massive creature. Some of the bark was splintered and torn, as if something powerful had raked it with force. "Okay, that is weird," Matt admitted, touching one of the scratches. "Looks like it's fresh, too." Sarah snapped a few photos, her excitement at discovering something so ominous overcoming her nerves. "It's probably just a bear, right?" she asked, though her voice wavered slightly. Maybe, Jake replied, though he didn't sound convinced. But whatever it was, it's got claws big enough to do some serious damage. Eric, watching from a few feet away, took a nervous step back. I think we should head back. We don't know what kind of animal made those marks, or if it's nearby, he urged, glancing over his shoulder. But Jake laughed it off, determined to press on. Come on, Eric. This is the kind of adventure we came for. You can't let a few scratches on a tree freak you out, he said, leading them further into the forest. Reluctantly, Eric followed, but a growing sense of dread gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in around them, and that whatever had left those marks was not far away, lurking, waiting. As they ventured further into the forest, the air grew thick with silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The trees stood tall and close together, their twisted branches forming dark shapes that seemed to reach for them. After about 20 minutes, they stumbled upon a clearing, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Scattered across the ground were remnants of an old campsite, a torn tent flap caught on a broken branch, a half-buried backpack with its contents spilled and decayed, and, most disturbingly, a single shoe lying upright in the mud, as if its owner had been snatched right out of it. A chill ran through them as they took in the scene. What happened here? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Looks like someone had a rough night, Matt said, trying to keep his tone light, though his hands trembled slightly as he nudged the discarded backpack with his foot. Jake, scanning the area with a tight expression, shook his head. This stuff has been here for a while. But whatever tore up that tent, his voice trailed off, and he glanced back into the dense woods, his confidence beginning to waver. Eric felt a surge of panic. He knew they shouldn't be here, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. We need to leave. Now, he said, his voice cracking with urgency. What if whatever did this is still out here? But Jake, stubborn as ever, took a deep breath and gestured for them to stay calm. It's probably just an old campsite. We'll head back soon. Let's just take a quick look around. Yet as they moved slowly through the clearing, each of them felt it, an oppressive sense of being watched, as if eyes were lurking in the shadows, tracking their every step. The trees seemed to close in, the silence thickening. The forest held its breath as if waiting for them to make a mistake. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor as the group reluctantly decided to head back to their campsite. The clearing behind them seemed to hum with an unnatural stillness, and every sound, every snapping twig or rustling leaf, felt amplified, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. Halfway back, Sarah suddenly stopped, holding up her hand. Did you hear that? She whispered, her eyes darting through the trees. The others froze, straining to listen. At first, there was only silence, but then it came, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the air, unmistakably close. It was deep and animalistic, yet there was something unnervingly wrong about it, something that didn't belong to any ordinary creature. Okay, what the hell was that? Matt hissed, his bravado evaporating as his eyes widened with fear. Before anyone could respond, the sound came again, louder this time. The underbrush to their left rustled violently, and then they saw it, a massive, hulking shadow moving between the trees. The creature was impossibly fast, its form obscured by the dim light, but the brief glimpses they caught were horrifying: clawed limbs, matted fur, and eyes that glowed faintly with a sickly, unnatural light. Run! Jake shouted, his voice breaking through the paralysis that gripped them. The group bolted, their panic taking over as they sprinted blindly through the woods. Behind them, the creature gave a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground, and the sound of its pursuit was unmistakable: branches snapping, leaves crunching, and the heavy thud of its steps closing in. Eric was the slowest, his terror making him clumsy. He tripped on a root, falling hard to the ground. "Help!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. Jake turned back, grabbing Eric by the arm and pulling him to his feet just as the creature burst through the trees. In the dying light, they saw it clearly for the first time, a monstrous, towering figure with jagged teeth and claws like scythes. Its matted fur was streaked with what looked like dried blood, and its face was a grotesque mockery of both human and animal features. The creature lunged, swiping at Eric with a single massive claw. Blood sprayed across the forest floor as Eric let out a strangled cry, collapsing. Jake yelled in fury, throwing a rock at the beast, but it barely flinched. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes on the remaining three, a low growl rumbling in its throat. "Run!" Jake shouted again, this time with a trembling voice. The others obeyed, tears streaming down Sarah's face as she and Matt sprinted deeper into the forest. Jake lingered for one agonizing second, looking back at Eric's lifeless body and the beast standing over it, before turning and fleeing into the darkness. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees that all looked the same under the fading light. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted ahead, her lungs burning and legs trembling. Behind her, Matt stumbled, glancing over his shoulder to see if the creature was still following. Jake ran ahead of them, leading the charge, his focus solely on finding any path out of the forest. "We can't keep running like this." Matt wheezed, doubling over for a second before Sarah yanked him back up. "We're gonna get lost." Sarah didn't stop. "It's already too late for that," she hissed, tears streaming down her face. The image of Eric's lifeless body, torn apart like a rag doll, was seared into her mind. "We just need to stay alive." From somewhere behind them, the creature's roar echoed through the trees, closer than any of them had hoped. It wasn't chasing them at full speed, it didn't have to. It was toying with them, letting the fear simmer before striking again. The realization hit Matt like a punch to the gut. "It's playing with us," he muttered, his voice trembling. Jake stopped abruptly, spinning around to face them. "If we split up, it'll have a harder time following all of us," he said, his voice firm but desperate. "We need to spread out." "No!" Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. "If we split up, it'll pick us off one by one." Jake hesitated, his mind racing, but before he could argue further, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps grew louder. The creature was closing in. Matt clenched his fists, stepping forward with a grim determination. "Go!" "I'll distract it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you insane?" Jake snapped. "That thing will kill you." "Someone has to slow it down," Matt replied, his face pale but resolute. "Just get her out of here." He didn't wait for their protests. Picking up a fallen branch, he took a deep breath and ran toward the sound of the approaching creature. "Matt, no!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking as Jake dragged her away. Tears blurred her vision as she fought against him, but Jake didn't let go. "We can't just leave him. He knows what he's doing." Jake barked, though his voice cracked with guilt. "If we stay, we're all dead." The two stumbled through the woods, Sarah sobbing uncontrollably as the sounds of Matt's desperate shouts and the creature's guttural growls echoed behind them. It didn't take long before his cries were cut off abruptly, leaving only a deafening silence. Jake and Sarah stopped, both panting and trembling. Jake refused to meet her eyes, his face twisted with anger and despair. "He bought us time," he said through clenched teeth. "We have to make it count." But Sarah couldn't stop shaking, the image of Matt's sacrifice haunting her. Somewhere in the shadows of the forest, the creature still hunted, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it found them again. Jake and Sarah trudged through the oppressive darkness, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. Every step felt like a struggle, the forest seeming to tighten around them, its twisted branches clawing at their clothes and faces. Neither of them spoke, the weight of Matt's sacrifice hung over them, and Eric's brutal death still played vividly in their minds. "Do you even know where we're going?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake hesitated but kept moving. "We just need to keep heading east. We'll hit the road eventually." "Eventually?" Sarah snapped, her fear boiling over into anger. "That thing is out there, Jake. It's going to kill us before we ever get out. Keep it together." Jake barked, his voice sharp. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression a mix of frustration and guilt. I'm not going to let it happen. We're getting out of here. Before Sarah could respond, a distant sound froze them both, a low, rumbling growl. It was far off but unmistakable. The creature hadn't given up its hunt. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her forward. Come on, we have to keep moving. They pushed through the undergrowth, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. The growls grew louder, echoing off the trees, until they seemed to come from all directions at once. Panic set in as Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root. She hit the ground hard, letting out a sharp cry. Get up! Jake hissed, hauling her to her feet just as a shadow moved through the trees ahead. The creature's glowing eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto them. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and turned to face it. Run, Sarah, he shouted, his voice trembling but fierce. No! I'm not leaving you, she cried, tears streaming down her face. Go! Jake roared, swinging the branch as the creature lunged. Sarah hesitated for a heart-wrenching moment, but then she turned and ran, her sobs mingling with the sound of Jake's desperate shouts. Behind her, the forest erupted into chaos, the crash of branches, Jake's defiant yells, and the creature's guttural snarls. Then, just as suddenly, everything fell silent. Sarah kept running, her legs burning and lungs screaming for air. She didn't dare look back. Somewhere ahead, she saw the faintest glimmer of light through the trees. The road. She stumbled forward, her vision swimming, until her feet hit gravel. She collapsed onto the edge of the road, gasping for breath as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. But she was alone. The soft hum of an approaching car broke the silence of the early morning. Sarah sat on the roadside, trembling and covered in scratches, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the rising sun. When the car came to a stop, the driver, a middle-aged man with wide, concerned eyes, hurried out. "Are you okay?" "What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. Sarah tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her body shook uncontrollably, and her throat felt raw from screaming. She could only shake her head as the man helped her into the car. As the vehicle sped toward the nearest town, Sarah stared out the window, her mind replaying the horrific events of the night. Jake's defiant yell echoed in her ears, followed by the gut-wrenching silence that had followed. She wanted to believe he'd survived, that somehow he'd fought off the creature and escaped. But deep down, she knew the truth. At the sheriff's office, Sarah recounted the nightmare as best she could, her voice trembling with every word. The officers exchanged skeptical glances but didn't interrupt. When she finished, they leaned back in their chairs, their expressions a mix of doubt and pity. "Miss, there've been rumors about that forest for years," one of them said. "But we've never found anything. No bodies, no animals, nothing unusual." Sarah's heart sank. "I'm not making this up," she insisted, her voice rising. "It's out there. It killed my friends." The officer gave her a tight smile. "We'll send a team to check it out." Days passed, and no bodies were recovered. No trace of Jake, Matt, or Eric. Sarah left town, but she couldn't leave behind the memories, or the fear. Weeks later, a group of hikers ventured into Blackwood Forest. They found a clearing littered with scraps of torn clothing and a bloodied shoe lying upright in the dirt. That night, as they gathered around their campfire, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. And the hunt began again.